The wind was a thief, stealing the last of the warmth from the rough-hewn planks of the cabin. It moaned through the ill-fitting window frames, a mournful sound that echoed the hollow space in Alara's chest. For 6 months, since the fever had taken Thomas, that hollow space had been her only constant companion. Now it was accompanied by the gnawing emptiness in her belly. The last of the flour was a dusty film at the bottom of the sack, the salt pork gone, the jar of dried apples nearly empty. Despair was a cold, heavy stone in her gut, heavier even than the grief. The Montana winter was coming, and it did not bargain. It simply took. Her gaze fell upon the newspaper, 3 weeks old, that the circuit preacher had left on his last pass. It was worn from her own fretful handling. The paper softened to the texture of old linen. Her eyes traced the same words for the 100th time, the ink a stark, desperate plea against the yellowed page. Widower with infant daughter requires a woman of good character for housekeeping and child-rearing. Room and board provided. Discretion assured. Inquire at the Blackwood Ranch, 2 days north of Redemption Creek. Each word was a tiny barb. Widower. A man who knew her loss. Infant daughter. A child without a mother. A mirror to the child she and Thomas had prayed for but never had. Good character. A phrase that felt like a judgment. A standard she feared she could no longer meet. Stripped as she was of everything but the clothes on her back and a wedding band that felt like a relic from another life. The ranch's name, Blackwood, tasted of ash and shadow in her mind. It promised nothing of comfort, only a continuation of the harshness that defined this land. But it also promised room and board, promised survival. The alternative was to remain here, to let the wind and the snow and the silence consume her, to become another unmarked grave on a prairie that was already full of them. A tremor ran through her, not from the cold, but from a flicker of resolve so fierce it felt like a fever. She would not be another ghost. Straightening her spine, Alara stood. The movement was stiff, her joints aching with a weariness that went bone deep. She looked around the small one-room cabin that had been her home, her world. It was a cage of memory and failure. Thomas had built it with his own hands, his laughter once filling the space now occupied by the keening wind. She walked to the small wooden chest at the foot of their bed and lifted the lid. Inside lay her only other dress, a simple calico, and a small velvet-lined box. She opened it. Nestled within was a silver locket, a gift from her mother. It was the last thing of value she owned. Closing the box, she placed it in the pocket of her worn wool skirt. She would not sell it. Not yet. It was a final anchor to the woman she had been. Her decision was made. She would answer the advertisement. She would walk 2 days north to a place called Blackwood, to a grieving man and a motherless child, and she would trade her dignity for a roof and a meal. It was not a choice born of hope, but of the final, brutal refusal to die. The journey was a pilgrimage through purgatory. Each step kicked up a cloud of ochre dust that coated her throat and clung to her skin. The sun beat down with a relentless, indifferent glare, bleaching the vast, empty sky to a pale, washed-out blue. The prairie stretched in every direction, an endless ocean of brittle, golden grass, its monotony broken only by the distant, jagged teeth of the mountains. Alara walked with her head down, a small bundle of her meager belongings tied in a shawl and slung over her shoulder. The landscape was an external manifestation of her own inner world, barren, silent, and achingly lonely. She thought of Thomas, of the way his hand had felt in hers, the callous strength of it a constant reassurance. Now her own hands were chapped and empty. By the end of the first day, her feet were blistered, her lips cracked. She slept fitfully, curled into a shallow ravine, the howl of a distant coyote a lonesome lullaby. When she finally saw the sign for the Blackwood Ranch, it was less a beacon of hope and more a simple, stark fact hammered into a weathered post. The name was branded into the wood in severe, black letters. The long drive led to a house that seemed to have grown from the land itself. It was made of dark, heavy timber, solid and unadorned, with a stone chimney at one end. It was a fortress against the wilderness, not a home. A man was on the porch watching her approach. He stood unmoving, a silhouette against the harsh afternoon light. As she drew closer, the details resolved themselves. He was tall and broad, dressed in work-worn denim and leather. His face was all harsh angles and shadow, framed by dark hair, his expression unreadable. He looked as weathered and unyielding as the land he occupied. This had to be Silas Blackwood. Alara stopped a dozen feet from the porch, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. She felt his eyes on her, a cool, assessing gaze that took in her dusty dress, her exhausted posture, the desperation she was certain was written all over her face. "I've come about the advertisement," she said, her voice a dry rasp. He gave a single curt nod. "You're the first." His voice was a low rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. It held no welcome, only fact. He did not invite her to the porch, nor did he offer her a drink of water. He simply waited. The test had already begun. "I am Alara," she offered, forcing herself to meet his gaze. Alara Miller, his eyes, she saw now, were a startlingly clear gray, the color of a winter sky just before a storm. They held a profound, bottomless sorrow that he seemed to make no effort to conceal. It was a grief so immense it had become part of his very structure, like bone. "My husband," he passed, the words felt inadequate, flimsy. "I can work, can cook, clean. I am of good character." He remained silent for another long moment, his gaze unwavering. She felt herself being weighed, measured, and found wanting. She was about to turn, to admit defeat and walk back into the wilderness, when a new sound pierced the heavy air. It was a thin, reedy cry from within the house. A baby's cry. Silas's expression did not change, but a flicker of something, pain, duty, an echo of loss, passed through his stone-gray eyes. He turned without another word and pushed open the heavy door, leaving it ajar. It was not an invitation, but an allowance. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Alara wiped her dusty hands on her skirt and stepped over the threshold, out of the glaring sun and into the shadows of the Blackwood house. The inside of the house was as stark as the man who owned it. The air was cool and smelled of pine wood, soap, and something else, the faint, milky scent of an infant. Everything was brutally clean, scrubbed, and orderly. A long wooden table with 2 benches dominated the main room. A stone fireplace, swept clean, stood cold and dark. There were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floor, no pictures on the walls. It was a space devoid of any softness, any touch of a woman's hand. It was the house of a man gutting himself of memory. The crying grew louder, more insistent, from a room off the main living area. Silas led the way, his heavy boots making no sound on the polished floorboards. He pushed open another door, revealing a small bedroom. In the center of the room, in a simple wooden cradle, lay the source of the sound. She was a tiny thing, red-faced and squalling, her minuscule fists balled in fury. A shock went through Alara, a physical jolt. The sight of the child, so small and utterly dependent, cracked something open inside her. The grief for her own lost chance at motherhood, a grief she had buried deep, surged with a painful, aching intensity. Silas stood beside the cradle, his large frame seeming to fill the entire room. He looked down at the infant not with affection, but with a kind of grim, pained responsibility. "Her name is Hope," he said, the words falling like chips of stone into the charged silence. The name was a paradox. It was the one thing this house, this man, this land seemed to lack entirely. Yet here it was, embodied in this tiny, screaming creature. Alara stepped forward, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. She reached into the cradle, her movements tentative. Her fingers brushed against the baby's cheek, which was wet with tears and surprisingly soft. The infant's cries hitched for a moment, her unfocused blue eyes blinking against the new presence. "May I?" Alara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Silas gave another of his clipped, economical nods. With a practiced gentleness she didn't know she still possessed, Elara lifted the baby from the cradle. The child was impossibly light, a fragile weight against her shoulder. She smelled of milk and clean linen. Elara began to rock her, a slow, steady rhythm, humming a tune she hadn't realized she remembered, one her own mother had hummed to her. The baby's cries slowly subsided, replaced by shuddering, hiccuping breaths. Her little body, once rigid with distress, began to relax against Elara's. She nestled her face into the crook of Elara's neck, her breathing evening out into the soft sighs of impending sleep. Elara closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the sensation. It was a phantom limb aching for a purpose it had been denied. In that moment, holding this stranger's child, she felt a flicker of something she had thought long dead. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It was purpose. She opened her eyes and looked at Silas. He was watching her, his face still a mask of stoicism, but the rigid set of his jaw had softened almost imperceptibly. He was not looking at her as a potential hire or a desperate woman. He was looking at her as the person who had silenced his daughter's cries. He had seen her do the one thing he could not. "The room at the end of the hall is yours," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "There's food in the pantry. Start tomorrow with that." He turned and left the room, leaving her alone with the sleeping child in her arms. The transaction was complete. She had a place. She had a purpose. And in the oppressive quiet of the Blackwood house, holding a baby named Hope, Elara felt the first, tentative shift of the stone in her gut. The days settled into a quiet, demanding rhythm, dictated by the rising sun and the infant's needs. Elara rose before dawn, the chill of the house seeping into her bones. She would light the stove, the scrape of the match and the blossoming flame a small act of defiance against the encroaching dark. Silas would already be gone, having risen in the blackness to tend to the livestock. He would leave a pail of fresh milk on the back step, a silent daily provision. Her world shrank to the four walls of the house and the small, demanding life within it. She learned the nuances of Hope's cries, the sharp, piercing wail of hunger, the fretful, whiny cry of tiredness, the sudden, pained shriek of a gas bubble. She bathed her, changed her, sang to her. She filled the silent house with the soft sounds of her own voice, a constant, low murmur meant to soothe the child, but which also served to soothe herself, to fill the echoing emptiness. Silas remained a peripheral, powerful presence. He moved around the edges of her new life, a figure of relentless industry. She would see him from the kitchen window, mending a fence line in the distance, his body a strong, dark line against the pale sky. He ate his meals in silence, his eyes fixed on his plate. He never complimented her cooking, but he ate every scrap of food she placed before him. The bread was always gone by the next morning. The stews vanished. His clean plate was her only praise, his continued provision her only contract. Conversation was sparse, utilitarian. "Need more firewood, flour is low." The gray mare through a shoe. Elara would respond with a simple nod or a quiet, "I'll add it to the list." They orbited each other like two distant planets, held in place by the gravitational pull of the child in the center of their universe. One night, a storm rolled in, a great, bruised mass of clouds that swallowed the mountains. The wind howled, rattling the windows in their frames, and a cold, driving rain lashed against the house. Inside, Hope was inconsolable. She screamed, her small body rigid, her face a mask of purple fury. Elara walked the floors with her, rocked her, sang to her, but nothing worked. The baby's cries seemed to escalate with the fury of the storm outside. Elara was near tears herself, her nerves frayed raw, her arms aching. The door to the main room opened, and Silas stood there, his hair damp from the rain. He had been in the barn. He watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable in the flickering lamplight. She felt a flush of failure, certain he was about to criticize her, to point out her inadequacy. Instead, he walked toward her. "Give her to me," he said. It was not a command, but a quiet request. Hesitantly, Elara transferred the wailing infant into his arms. It was a jarring sight. The tiny, fragile baby held against the vast, hard expanse of his chest. His hands, calloused and scarred from labor, looked enormous as they enveloped his daughter's small frame. He held her differently than Alara did, positioning her face down along his forearm, her head cradled in his hand. He began to pace, his long, slow strides a stark contrast to Alara's frantic energy. And he began to hum. It was not a tune, but a low, resonant sound, a deep thrumming that seemed to emanate from the core of his being. It was the sound of the earth itself, ancient and steady. Miraculously, the baby's screams began to subside. Her rigid body softened. The cries turned to whimpers, then to soft, shuddering breaths. Within minutes, she was asleep, lulled by the storm in her father's arms. Silas stopped pacing and looked at Alara over the sleeping child. In the dim light, she saw the exhaustion etched around his eyes, the deep lines of a grief that never truly slept. For the first time, she did not see a harsh employer or a silent stranger. She saw a man, utterly wrecked by loss, doing the only thing he knew how to do: endure. In that shared moment of quiet relief, with the storm raging outside and the baby breathing peacefully between them, a silent understanding passed. It was not friendship, not yet. It was the recognition of a shared burden, a fragile truce in the war against sorrow. The trip to Redemption Creek was a necessity they could no longer postpone. The pantry was growing bare, and Hope needed warmer clothes for the coming winter. The thought of facing the town filled Alara with a quiet dread. She was the woman living in the dead wife's house, caring for the dead wife's child. She knew what the whispers would say. Silas seemed to sense her apprehension. "We'll leave at dawn," was all he said the night before, his tone leaving no room for argument. He would not send her alone. The buckboard ride was cold and silent. Silas handled the reins with an easy, competent grip, his eyes scanning the horizon. Alara sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the baby bundled securely between them. Redemption Creek was little more than a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, but on supply day, it bustled with a nervous energy. As Silas pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the general store, Alara felt the eyes on them. They were immediate and sharp. Women paused in their gossip, their faces hardening with judgment. Men tipped their hats to Silas with a reserved, pitying respect, their gazes sliding sideways to linger on her. She was an anomaly, an intrusion into the town's tidy narrative of his tragedy. Inside the store, the air was thick with the smells of coffee beans, leather, and unspoken questions. Mrs. Gable, the proprietor's wife, a woman with a face like a clenched fist, greeted Silas with a practiced sympathy. "Silas, so good to see you." And the dear child, her eyes, small and sharp as a bird's, flicked to Alara, dismissing her entirely. "We have a new shipment of flannel." For the little 1 inch as Alara moved through the store, gathering flour, sugar, and beans, she could feel the weight of the town's collective stare. She heard a snippet of conversation from behind a stack of bolts of cloth. "Hardly decent. Poor Mary, not even cold in her grave." Heard she just walked up to his door. "A desperate woman will do desperate things." The words were like small, sharp stones thrown at her back. A hot flush of shame and anger rose in her throat. She was not a predator. She was a survivor. She kept her eyes down, her movements precise and efficient, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her distress. When she brought her items to the counter, Silas was already there, a heavy sack of oats on his shoulder. He placed it by the door and turned back, his presence seeming to suck the air from the room. He looked from the pile of goods to Alara's face, which she knew was pale and strained. He then let his gaze drift over the other customers, over the pinched, judgmental face of Mrs. Gable. His expression did not change, but a cold authority settled into his posture. The whispers died instantly. The other shoppers suddenly found fascinating things to look at on the shelves. Silas paid the bill, his movements deliberate. He did not rush. He did not acknowledge the sudden, tense silence he had created. He simply took up the remaining sacks. "Let's go," he said, his voice low and directed only at her. Outside, as he loaded the wagon, Alara stood holding Hope, her body trembling slightly. He had not said a word in her defense. He had not needed to. His quiet, unyielding presence had been a shield. He had stood between her and the town's cruelty, a silent guardian. As they rode out of town, leaving the dust and the judgment behind, Alara felt a strange sense of gratitude. He had protected her. It was not personal, she told herself. He was protecting his household, his arrangement. But as she glanced at his profile, at the hard line of his jaw set against the vast, empty landscape, she understood that his protection was the only kindness he knew how to offer. And for now it was enough. A blizzard descended without warning, a churning wall of white that erased the world. One moment, the sky was a sheet of dull pewter. The next, the air was a blinding, suffocating vortex of snow. The wind screamed like a banshee, piling drifts against the doors and windows, isolating the Blackwood ranch from everything but the storm's fury. For days they were prisoners in the house. The world shrank to the circle of light cast by the oil lamps and the radiant heat of the constantly fed stove. The relentless howl of the wind was a constant, unnerving presence, a reminder of their fragility. The forced proximity was a crucible. The silence that had once been a buffer between them was now filled with the sounds of their shared existence. The crackle of the fire, the rhythmic creak of the floorboards as Alara paced with Hope, the scrape of Silas's knife as he sat at the long table, methodically carving a piece of wood. The tension was palpable, a third entity in the room. On the third night of their confinement, the storm reached its zenith. Hope was sleeping peacefully in her cradle, a small island of tranquility in the chaos. Alara was mending one of Silas's shirts by the fire, her fingers nimble despite the chill. The rhythmic push and pull of the needle was a meditative act. Silas sat across from her, the piece of wood in his hands slowly taking shape. She watched him from the corner of her eye. His large, rough hands were surprisingly deft, peeling away fine curls of wood to reveal the form within. It was a bird, its wings half lifted as if in mid-flight. "It's beautiful," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. He paused, his knife still. He didn't look at her, but stared at the small wooden bird in his palm. "I used to make them for Mary," he said. His voice was rough, and used to the shape of his late wife's name. It was the first time he had ever mentioned her. The name hung in the air between them, fraught with memory and loss. Alara's needle stilled. She waited, sensing that to speak would be to break the fragile spell. "She liked birds," he continued, his gaze distant, lost in a past Alara could not see. "Said they were the only things on this land that knew what freedom was. She wasn't made for this place." Too gentle, he fell silent, the confession leaving him exposed. He had revealed a crack in his formidable armor, a glimpse of the man beneath the grief. Alara felt a pang of empathy so sharp it took her breath away. She knew what it was to feel that this land demanded a hardness one did not possess. "My Thomas," she began, her own voice quiet and thick with emotion. "He loved the stars. He said each one was a promise. That no matter how dark it got, there was always light somewhere." She looked into the fire, the flames dancing and shifting, just as memory did. "He made so many promises, the silence that followed was different. It was not empty or tense, but filled with a shared, unspoken understanding. They were two solitary lighthouses, their beams finally crossing in the vast, stormy darkness of their grief. They had acknowledged the ghosts that haunted the house, and in doing so had made them less terrifying. Silas carefully placed the small, unfinished bird on the mantelpiece. He looked at Alara, his gray eyes clear and direct in the firelight. There was no pity in his gaze, only a quiet recognition. He was seeing her, not just as the woman who cared for his child, but as someone who also carried the weight of a great and profound loss. The storm raged on outside, but within the small, warm circle of the fire, something had shifted. A foundation, built not on convenience, but on the bedrock of shared sorrow, had been laid. The thaw came, and with it a new kind of threat. The melting snow turned the plains to a muddy quagmire, making travel difficult and isolating the ranch further. It was during this vulnerable season that the rustlers came. They were brazen, made bold by the law's long reach and the ranch's remote location. Elara was woken not by a sound, but by a sudden, tense stillness in the house. The familiar night noises, the creak of the wood settling, the sigh of the wind had ceased. A primal instinct, cold and sharp, prickled at the back of her neck. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet silent on the cold floorboards. A sliver of moonlight cut through a gap in the main room's curtains, revealing Silas's silhouette. He was standing by the window, utterly motionless, a rifle held loosely in one hand. He was not looking out but listening. He had heard it too. He turned his head slightly as she approached, acknowledging her presence with a barely perceptible movement. "Stay in here," he whispered, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Bar the door. Keep the child quiet." Fear, cold and metallic, flooded Elara's veins. It was not the abstract fear of starvation or loneliness, but the immediate, visceral terror of violence. Her first instinct was to grab Hope and hide, to cower in the dark until it was over. But then she looked at Silas. He was calm, his focus absolute. He was not a farmer preparing to defend his property. He was a predator whose territory had been invaded. And in his eyes, she saw he was not just defending his livestock. He was defending the house. He was defending the child. He was defending her. A strange and unfamiliar fire kindled in her chest, burning away the cold fear. This was her home now. That child was, in every way that mattered, her child. She would not hide. "There is another rifle," she said, her own voice a steady whisper that surprised her. Above the mantel he glanced at her, a flicker of surprise in his gray eyes. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Load it." The command was an acceptance, an acknowledgement of her as an ally, not a liability. While he slipped out the back door, melting into the shadows of the yard, Elara moved with a newfound purpose. Her hands, which had trembled with fear only moments before, were now steady as she took down the heavy rifle. She had watched Thomas load his often enough. Her fingers found the cartridges, the cold weight of the brass a comfort. She worked quickly, the metallic clicks of the mechanism loud in the silent house. She barred the door as he had instructed and moved to the window, peering into the moonlit yard. She could see them now. 3 shadowy figures moving toward the corral where Silas kept his prize bull. There was a sudden shout from the darkness, followed by the deafening crack of Silas's rifle. One of the shadows crumpled to the ground. The other 2 scattered, firing blindly toward the house. A bullet splintered the window frame near Elara's head, showering her with wood chips. She didn't flinch. She crouched lower, her heart hammering, the rifle heavy in her hands. She was terrified, but she was not helpless. She was the guardian of the flame inside, and she would not let it be extinguished. The exchange of gunfire was brutal and blessedly brief. Another shot echoed from the direction of the barn, followed by a cry of pain and the sound of horses galloping away in a frantic retreat. Then, silence descended once more, deeper and more profound than before. The world held its breath. Elara waited, her knuckles white on the stock of the rifle, her ears straining for any sound. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, she heard the soft crunch of a single set of boots on the gravel path leading to the back door. A quiet knock. "Elara," it was Silas's voice, strained. She fumbled with the bar, her hands shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. She swung the door open. He stood there, leaning against the frame, his face pale in the moonlight. There was a dark, spreading stain on his left sleeve, high on the shoulder. "You're hurt," she breathed, the words catching in her throat. "It's nothing," he grunted, but his posture betrayed him. He swayed slightly as he stepped inside. She guided him to the table and lit a lamp, her hands moving with an urgency she hadn't known she possessed. The light revealed the gash was a deep graze, bleeding freely but not life-threatening. The sight of his blood, dark against the pale fabric of his shirt, made the reality of the night's violence crash down on her. "Sit," she commanded, her voice firm. For once, he did as he was told, slumping onto the bench with a weary sigh. She fetched the basin, water, and clean cloths, her mind clear and focused. She had tended to Thomas's injuries from farm accidents, but this was different. This wound was given in defense of her, of them. As she carefully cut away the sleeve and began to clean the wound, he watched her, his expression unguarded for the first time. The hard mask of the stoic rancher had fallen away, revealing the vulnerable man beneath. Her touch was gentle but efficient, her movements sure. She worked in silence, concentrating on the task, pouring a small amount of whiskey over the wound to cleanse it. He hissed in a sharp breath but did not pull away. When she was done, she wrapped his shoulder tightly with strips of clean linen. Their proximity was intense in the quiet room. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin, smell the scent of gunpowder, sweat, and the faint metallic tang of blood. He had not taken his eyes off her. "Thank you," he said, his voice a low rasp. It was more than gratitude for the bandage. It was an acknowledgement of everything, of her standing with him, of her not breaking, of her becoming a fortress herself. She simply nodded, her throat too tight for words. She looked at his hand, resting on the table, the knuckles bruised and scraped. Without thinking, she reached out and laid her own hand over his. It was a simple, instinctive gesture of comfort, of connection. His hand was large and warm, and for a moment he did not move. Then, slowly, he turned his hand over and curled his fingers around hers. His grip was not forceful, but it was firm, a silent, binding contract. In the aftermath of violence, in the quiet of the lamplit kitchen, a new and powerful bond had been forged. It was a bond of shared risk and mutual reliance, a partnership sealed not with vows, but with blood and gunpowder and a quiet, steady courage. Life on the ranch found a new equilibrium. The silence that returned was no longer laden with unspoken grief or the tension of strangers. It was a comfortable quiet, the easy silence of two people who understood each other without the need for constant words. The small, unspoken gestures of their life together took on a deeper meaning. The cup of coffee he now left for her on the warm stove each morning was a daily greeting. The way she mended a tear in his jacket before he thought to ask was a quiet act of care. They were a partnership, functioning with an intuitive grace that had been born in crisis. The land itself seemed to respond to the change. The harsh, muddy spring gave way to a vibrant early summer. The prairie grasses turned a lush green, and wildflowers, purple lupin and yellow balsamroot, dusted the hillsides with color. The world felt softer, more forgiving. Hope was thriving. She was no longer a fragile infant but a sturdy, curious baby on the cusp of toddlerhood. She had Silas's serious gray eyes but a quick, easy smile that was all her own. She was the bright, warm center of their world. One afternoon, Alara was sitting on the porch steps, watching Hope crawl with determined concentration across the wooden planks. The baby paused, pushed herself up onto her chubby knees, and looked directly at Alara. "Mama," she said, the sound clear and distinct. The world stopped. Alara's heart gave a painful lurch, a complex mixture of profound joy and sudden, sharp anxiety. It was the word she had longed to hear her entire life, a word she had thought she would never be called. She held her breath, her gaze darting toward the barn where Silas was working. What would he think? Would he see it as a betrayal of Mary's memory? Would it shatter the fragile peace they had built? Hope, pleased with her new sound, repeated it, "Mama," and held out her arms to be picked up. Alara scooped her up, holding her tight, burying her face in the baby's soft, clean-smelling hair. She felt a fierce, possessive love that was so powerful it frightened her. This was her daughter, not of blood, but of heart, of labor, of love. Later that evening, as they sat at the dinner table, Silas was quieter than usual. Alara's anxiety returned, a cold knot in her stomach. She braced herself for his anger, for his resentment. After they had eaten, he spoke. "I heard her today," he said, not looking at her, his voice carefully neutral. Alara's hands stilled in her lap. On the porch, she could only nod, unable to form a reply. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the window. Alara prepared herself for the blow, for the reminder that she was merely an employee, a substitute. "A child needs a mother," he said finally, his voice low and rough. He turned his head and met her eyes. The storm-gray depths held no anger, only a quiet, solemn acceptance. In his gaze she saw permission. She saw acknowledgement. She saw that he, too, had come to see her not as a replacement for the woman he had lost, but as the woman who was here, the woman who was raising his daughter. He was letting Mary's ghost rest, and in doing so, he was allowing Alara to truly live. A single tear escaped her eye and traced a hot path down her cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow, but of release. The title she had been given by a child's tongue had been ratified by the father's heart. The seasons turned, pulling them from the green abundance of summer into the crisp, golden light of autumn. The days grew shorter, the nights colder, but the house was no longer a cold, stark shelter. It was a home, filled with the warmth of the fire, the smell of baking bread, and the sound of Hope's delighted shrieks as she took her first wobbly steps across the wooden floor. Alara had found a rhythm not just of survival, but of contentment. She had stitched new curtains for the windows from a bolt of cheerful yellow calico, and the afternoon sun now filtered through them, painting the room in soft, warm stripes. She had placed the small, wooden bird Silas had carved on the mantel, a silent testament to the night the walls between them had begun to crumble. She no longer felt like an imposter. The judgmental stares in town had softened to looks of grudging respect. She was no longer the desperate widow who had appeared at Silas Blackwood's door. She was the woman who had made his house a home again, the mother to his child. One clear, cold afternoon, she stood in the yard, holding Hope's small hands as the toddler practiced walking on the uneven ground. The child stumbled, fell with a soft thump onto the grass, and looked up at Alara with a grin, utterly undaunted. Resilience, Alara thought. This land breeds it into you. Silas emerged from the barn and walked toward them. He moved with the same quiet purpose as always, but the heavy weight of grief no longer seemed to bow his shoulders. He stopped beside her, his presence a familiar comfort, a solid anchor in her world. They stood together in silence for a moment, watching his daughter, their daughter, pick herself up and try again. "Mary would have liked you," Silas said, his voice quiet, directed at the distant mountains. "You're strong." In a way she wasn't. It was the highest praise he could offer, a final, gentle laying to rest of his past. He was not comparing them, but acknowledging Alara's own unique strength, the quality that had allowed her to survive, to endure, and finally to flourish here. He turned to look at her then, his gray eyes clear and serious. The wind picked up, tugging a loose strand of hair across her face. He reached out, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle, and tucked it behind her ear. It was the first time he had touched her with such deliberate tenderness. The simple gesture was more intimate than a kiss. "The circuit preacher is coming round next month," he stated, his gaze holding hers. It was not a question. It was not a proposal born of romance or flowery words. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of intent. It was a recognition of what they had already become, a family. It was a promise of a shared future, as solid and dependable as the man standing before her. Alara looked from his earnest face to the small child now toddling determinately toward them, her arms outstretched. She looked at the house, no longer a place of shadows but of light. She had come here seeking shelter and had found a home. She had come seeking a purpose and had found a daughter. She had come expecting a harsh master and had found a partner. A slow smile spread across her face, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes. She gave a single, certain nod. Hope reached them, wrapping her small arms around Alara's leg. Silas knelt, his large hand resting on his daughter's back, his other finding Alara's. The three of them stood together, a small, resilient unit under the vast, endless sky. A family forged in the crucible of loss and rebuilt with the quiet, unyielding strength of love.